Unexpected shock. The disintegration of a power dynamic. Less than a month before the high-stakes Australian Open, and immediately following the most dominant season of his professional career, Carlos Alcaraz posted an announcement that sent shockwaves through the sporting world. There was no elaborate drama, no lengthy explanation, and absolutely no prior warning. Juan Carlos Ferrero, the mentor who had been by his side for 7 grueling years, the architect behind 6 Grand Slam titles, and the youngest world number 1 in history, simply vanished from the team overnight. For fans and analysts alike, this wasn't just a headline. It was a tectonic shift in the landscape of modern tennis. What makes this truly chilling is that this wasn't a tennis breakup in the traditional sense. This wasn't a dispute over a declining forehand, a technical hitch in a serve, or a failed tactical approach during a big match. It wasn't even about a dip in performance. This is a raw story about cold hard cash, absolute control, and the hidden figures who are actually pulling the strings of the Alcaraz empire. Once you begin to peel back the layers of this professional divorce, the reality behind the scenes is enough to make you shiver. If you crave deep dives into the murky waters of tennis politics, uncomfortable truths that mainstream media refuses to acknowledge, and the stories that the cameras never dare to capture, make sure to subscribe to Pro Tennis 360. We don't do PR spin. We live in the raw truth of the present. Believe me, this revelation will permanently alter your perception of professional tennis. Now let's dissect what truly transpired. On the surface, even to a casual observer, this split is illogical. Ferrero didn't inherit a broken player. He didn't have to resuscitate a fading star. He painstakingly engineered monster. 6 Grand Slams across every surface, and the world number 1 spot at just 22 years old is a feat of legendary proportions. This is the kind of partnership that usually culminates in an emotional, televised farewell ceremony, not a cold social media post. So, when the hammer fell, the world asked, why? That is when Carlos Santos, the man who first discovered Alcaraz, dropped an information bombshell that paints a far darker picture than anyone imagined. The Santos revelation, it's not about tennis. Exposing the core, a clash over money and dominance. According to Carlos Santos, this split had zero connection to the sport of tennis itself. There were no strategic disagreements regarding court positioning or point construction. There was no conflict over the development of technical skills or a sudden loss of faith in one another's abilities. On the surface, a mutual agreement sounds plausible, but the reality is much more transactional. Santos spoke candidly. This was a fundamental dispute over financial terms and the ownership of time. In the high-pressure world of elite sports, constant presence isn't just a preference. It is a vital form of leverage. Alcaraz, or rather, the figures surrounding him, demanded that Ferrero be present everywhere. Every minor tournament, every grueling flight, every media appearance. They sought a 24/7, full-time commitment of absolute devotion. Ferrero, a man who has his own family and a prestigious academy to manage, could no longer, or perhaps no longer wish to, meet these suffocating demands. Once that leverage of constant presence vanishes in the eyes of a superstar's camp, the coach is no longer viewed as a partner. They are downgraded to a mere employee. The narrative takes an even more uncomfortable turn here. Santos revealed what many insiders only dare to whisper in the shadows. Carlos Alcaraz's father is the ultimate decision-maker, not the coach, and increasingly, not even the player himself. It is the patriarch of the family who holds the veto power. Santos admitted that while Alcaraz would have likely stayed with Ferrero out of personal loyalty, that sentiment didn't matter. The decision was snatched out of their hands by the family office. Santos has a bitter, first-hand perspective on this dynamic. He coached Carlitos for 8 years, only to vanish for the exact same reasons. He wanted specific professional conditions. The father refused to budge. Ferrero lasted 7 years. Santos lasted 8. Different eras of Alcaraz's career, yet identical endings. This is not a series of unfortunate events. It is a calculated business model. Ferrero's parting statement contained the most heartbreakingly honest phrase, "I wanted to continue." This wasn't a mutual handshake. This was a legendary coach being politely escorted to the exit. Spanish media later confirmed that contract negotiations didn't just stall. They disintegrated entirely over fundamental disagreements on how to manage the player's future direction. The philosophy clash: discipline versus freedom. Family intervention versus elite professionalism. Juan Carlos Ferrero is a man defined by the old-school philosophy. He is stoic, reserved, and believes in the absolute sanctity of discipline. Carlos Alcaraz, conversely, has become the global face of joy, flair, and the freedom to play instinctively. While the Netflix documentary on Alcaraz was framed as a marketing masterpiece, it served a second purpose. It was a manifesto of Alcaraz's desire to do things his way. This concept of his way isn't about laziness. It's about who controls the schedule, who chooses the commitments, and who defines what professional structure looks like. The tension began when Ferrero's demand for rigid discipline collided with the family's desire for Alcaraz to have more flexibility. Essentially, it was a battle for the soul of the player's career. Who decides how much family time is allowed? Who dictates the training intensity? Ferrero likely wanted more autonomy as the head of the team, while Alcaraz's camp wanted a structure that prioritized the family's comfort. In the world of elite tennis, one of these philosophies must eventually break. The friction didn't just appear out of thin air in late 2025. Insiders point back to a pivotal moment in 2023 when Ferrero refused to travel to South America, choosing instead to delegate the tour to assistants. This sparked a volatile argument with Alcaraz's father, a rift that many say never truly healed. Ferrero began to publicly question Alcaraz's off-court professionalism, stressing the need for better sleep, rest, and a solid foundation. At the time, these sounded like the wise words of a mentor. In hindsight, they were the warning shots of a coming war. By 2025, the shift was undeniable. Ferrero was traveling less, while Samuel Lopez took on a more prominent role. Alcaraz stopped making the one-hour drive to Ferrero's famed academy to train. Instead, the center of gravity shifted to a private facility run by the Alcaraz family. It became an unavoidable question. Would the world number one adapt to the coach, or would the coach have to submit to the star? 9 days before Christmas, the verdict was delivered. Power won. In the ecosystem of professional tennis, once the power shifts from the coach to the family, it never shifts back. The money question: what Ferrero really wanted. The financial breakdown: brutal truths and massive numbers. Let's strip away the sentimentality and talk about the cold reality. Money. This is where the story turns truly ugly. Ferrero was never a budget coach, nor should he have been. He transformed Alcaraz into a global brand, helping him amass tens of millions in prize money and hundreds of millions in endorsement value. When you are the primary engine behind a wealth-generating machine of that magnitude, you expect to be compensated proportionally to the value you have created. According to high-level Spanish media sources, Ferrero's deal-breaker conditions were simple but significant. He wanted a salary increase that reflected his status as the premier coach in the world, and more importantly, he wanted executive control over the player's season strategy. To a coach, this is standard. To the Alcaraz family, it was a threat. They had no intention of granting anyone more power than the family council already held. They certainly weren't going to pay a coach so much that he became unfireable or too powerful to manage. The irony here is palpable. Ferrero helped build this massive empire brick by brick. However, once the empire reached its current scale, there was no longer room for an architect, only for contractors who would follow the family's blueprints without question. Carlos Santos's observation remains the most piercing. In modern tennis, the family always wins. The coach is just a seasonal hire. It is a brutal assessment, but it is supported by the history of the sport. Look at the titans of the game. Novak Djokovic eventually parted ways with Marian Vida after 15 years because of disagreements over direction. Rafael Nadal eventually moved on from the absolute authority of Uncle Tony as his team sought a different kind of power. This is the superstar cycle. Alcaraz and Ferrero are simply the newest protagonists in a very old, very predictable story. Ferrero saw the writing on the wall as early as 2023. He felt the tectonic plates of power shifting beneath him. But he stayed because he genuinely believed in the boy. In the end, his loyalty was met with a pink slip. This isn't just a story about a contract. It's a story about the inevitable moment when a star outgrows the person who made them. Psychological analysis. The Alcaraz family dynamic. House of Alcaraz. Who is truly steering the ship? We need to pause the timeline to address the most critical psychological element of this saga. The family dynamic. Carlos Alcaraz is arguably the most talented player of his generation, but we have to ask the question that makes the tennis establishment squirm. Is Carlos actually the CEO of his own life? The evidence suggests a very different reality. Every major turning point in his career, the firing of Santos, the dismissal of Ferrero, the relocation of his training base to a family-run academy, was a decision orchestrated by his father. While Alcaraz is a 22-year-old multimillionaire and a global icon, in the context of his professional world, he remains an obedient son. This is a common phenomenon in sports. Family power acts as a shield when an athlete is young, protecting them from sharks and bad deals. However, that same shield becomes a cage as the athlete matures. At some point, every great champion must choose. Do they want to be an independent professional athlete, or do they want to remain a child within a family business? Ferrero's goal was Alcaraz's total maturity. He wanted Carlos to take ownership of his own discipline, his own schedule, and his own mistakes. He wanted him to be the boss. But the family? They wanted to maintain the status quo. They have invested decades into this project, and now that the dividends are rolling in, they aren't about to let an outsider, even one as instrumental as Ferrero, have a louder voice than the bloodline. This is the classic control trap. While tight family control protects a player from making bad, independent choices, it also prevents them from developing the psychological resilience needed to survive without a support net. Ferrero represented independence, and independence is precisely what a controlling family office fears most. He was a voice that could challenge the father, a voice that could say no to the family's whims. In the Alcaraz power structure, that dissenting voice was a virus that needed to be eliminated to ensure the family's total sovereignty. The 2023 South America incident, the beginning of the end. The South American crack, seeds of the ultimate crisis. To understand the 2025 split, we must revisit the South American tour of 2023. This was the moment the foundation cracked, though the public wouldn't see it for years. Alcaraz was scheduled for a grueling swing of tournaments, long flights, extreme humidity, and constant time zone changes. Ferrero looked at the situation and made a choice that was strategically sound but politically disastrous. He stayed home. Ferrero wasn't being lazy. He was being a teacher. He believed that for Alcaraz to reach the next level of greatness, he needed to learn how to manage his own routine and mental state without his mentor holding his hand. He wanted to empower his assistant, Samuel Lopez, and see if Alcaraz could maintain his world-class standard independently. It was a long-term play for psychological toughness. Alcaraz's father, however, didn't see a lesson. He saw an abandonment. According to Santos, the resulting argument was nuclear. The father felt Ferrero was neglecting his son during a vital part of the season. Ferrero felt his professional judgment was being undermined by a non-expert. Neither side blinked. From that day forward, the unbreakable bond was a myth. They continued to win, and they continued to smile for the cameras. But the fundamental trust required for a coach-player partnership had evaporated. The tragedy is that Ferrero was objectively correct. A champion needs the resilience to perform when the system around them isn't perfect. That is the difference between a one-hit wonder and a 20-time Grand Slam winner. But the Alcaraz family interprets coaching through the lens of commitment, and in their world, commitment equals 100% attendance. If you aren't there, you don't care. That level of demand is psychologically and physically exhausting for any coach, especially one with a life of his own. The clash was inevitable. Ferrero wanted a sustainable professional balance. The family wanted total, subservient devotion. On that cold December day in 2025, The family's demand for total devotion finally won out. The broader implications, what this means for tennis. A new era, the rise of the employee coach. Let's zoom out from the Alcaraz camp and look at the sport as a whole, because this saga signals a disturbing trend for the future of tennis. During the legendary Big Three era, the relationship between a coach and a player was a true partnership of equals. Think of Severin Luthi with Federer, Uncle Tony with Nadal, or Marian Vida with Djokovic. These weren't just guys hired to hit balls. They were pillars of authority who shared power with the athlete. They were respected as the architects of greatness. But the next-gen era is ushering in a much colder dynamic. We see it everywhere. Jannik Sinner parting ways with Riccardo Piatti after years of success because the camp wanted more control. Daniil Medvedev rotating through staff because no one is allowed to challenge his on-court outbursts. Holger Rune changing coaches faster than some people change their tennis strings. The era of the mentor is being replaced by the era of the interchangeable employee. Let's be brutally honest. When you possess Alcaraz's wealth and fame, why would you tolerate a coach who tells you things you don't want to hear? Why keep a Ferrero who demands 10 p.m. bedtimes when you can hire a Samuel Lopez who is just happy to be there? This is a dangerous trajectory. History proves that the greatest champions in any sport are those who have someone in their corner with the courage to say no to them. Federer had Luthi to keep him grounded. Nadal had Uncle Tony to remind him he was just another player. Djokovic had Vida to provide emotional stability. Alcaraz has now effectively removed that safety valve. Samuel Lopez is a competent technician, but he lacks Ferrero's global stature and historical authority. Most crucially, he does not have the political capital to stand up to the Alcaraz family council. This means Alcaraz is now entering the most critical years of his career, surrounded exclusively by yes men. He will be told what he wants to hear, not what he needs to hear. And historically, that is exactly how world-class champions decline into mere great players. The comparison, Alcaraz versus Sinner's stability. A tale of two systems. Stability versus turmoil. Now we must address the comparison that is currently the talk of the locker room. Jannik Sinner is winning the coaching war by a landslide. While Alcaraz was busy dismantling his support system, Sinner was reinforcing his. By retaining Simone Vagnazzi and Darren Cahill, Sinner created a multi-layered, stable environment devoid of family drama. The results speak for themselves. Sinner just concluded a career-best season with 2 Grand Slams and a level of week-to-week consistency that Alcaraz simply couldn't match. Does Alcaraz have more raw, natural talent? Perhaps. But Sinner undeniably has a superior system. At the stratospheric levels of professional tennis, talent gets you into the top 10, but the system gets you to 20 Grand Slams. Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic didn't just win on talent. They won because they had fortress teams that protected them from external distractions. Alcaraz just took a sledgehammer to his own fortress. Let's look at the stark contrast. The Sinner team features 2 coaches who complement each other, a clear hierarchy of responsibilities, and, most importantly, 0 excessive influence from his family. This is a recipe for long-term psychological health. Alcaraz's new team, by contrast, features a head coach who lacks experience at the very top of the game, a family office that micromanages every detail, and an environment where no one is allowed to be a dissenting voice. History is littered with cautionary tales of players who fired their legendary mentors for personal or visionary reasons, only to find themselves in a tailspin. When Andy Murray first split with Ivan Lendl, his results plummeted. When Nadal drifted away from the rigid authority of Uncle Tony, his injury rate and mental lapses increased. When Djokovic briefly ditched Vida, he spent 2 years in a professional wilderness. The pattern is clear and unforgiving. Alcaraz might think he is the exception to the rule, but the ghosts of tennis past suggest otherwise. The stability of Sinner's camp versus the volatility of Alcaraz's camp will likely define the rivalry of the next decade. The future, what happens next for Alcaraz? The uncertain horizon, the cost of a new direction. The real question moving forward isn't whether Carlos Alcaraz will continue to win matches. He is far too gifted to suddenly stop winning. The question is, will he fulfill his destiny as an all-time great, or will he be another what-if story? There are three distinct paths this could take. Scenario A, the best case. Samuel Lopez miraculously evolves into a world-class head coach. Alcaraz, stung by the criticism of his freedom, finds a way to self-discipline. The family realizes their overreach and retreats into the background. In 5 years, we look back and say Ferrero was the nursery coach and Lopez was the finishing coach. This is the dream, but it requires a level of self-awareness rarely seen in family-run empires. Scenario B, the realist case. Alcaraz experiences immediate turbulence. He loses a few matches he should have won at the Australian Open. The media, smelling blood in the water, begins to ruthlessly question the Ferrero split. The family panics under the pressure and hires a big-name former player like Moya or Wielander as a figurehead. The cycle of instability begins, and Alcaraz spends his prime years constantly adjusting to new voices. Scenario C, the nightmare case. Alcaraz never finds his center again. Without Ferrero's rigid structure, his off-court focus drifts. He becomes a showman rather than a winner. He wins a Grand Slam every 2 or 3 years, but he is consistently outclassed by the disciplined machine of Jannik Sinner. He becomes the lost generation poster boy, infinite talent, limited silverware. Alcaraz needs to do 4 things immediately to avoid the nightmare. Set hard boundaries with his father. He must become the CEO of Alcaraz Inc. Hire a counter voice. He needs someone who isn't afraid to get fired for telling him the truth. Commit to a 5-year plan. Stop the reactive changes. Embrace the boring professionalism. Ferrero was right. Structure is the only thing that survives the pressure of a slam final.